Thank you for joining us this evening to launch the 5th edition of the publication Content, its name being Skyplane. Content is a publication that explores the formal, cultural and technical issues of architecture through detailed drawings, photographs and text. Skyplane was edited by Richard Francis Jones, Lawrence Neal, Xing Ruan and Deborah van der Plat. I welcome you all tonight, a community of students, academics and industry professionals. Many people here prominent in their field who join the academic staff of the faculty, dedicated to conducting research and inspired to guide the education of the next generation of professionals who will design our buildings and the public domain we share. And to those students here tonight, I support your decision to seek out these opportunities to be informed by and contribute to the discussions we will have later on tonight. And I hope you gain something from this presentation that will reinforce your passion and interest in architecture, a discipline that involves lifelong commitment to learning and public discussion, as evidenced by evenings such as the one we're about to enjoy. And I'd like to now just mention something about our faculty at the Built Environment. Many of you know it, but some may not. But I would say that a couple of things distinguish us, and it's about our focus and relevance to contemporary issues. For example, we know today that a sustainable future for the built environment involves an integrated application of sustainable principles in design, construction, and the management of public and private property, or the land and the buildings and structures on it. We do this because we have a real breadth across all the disciplines in the built environment. And we also value evidence-based research to guide design thinking. We also know and value the contribution to our culture that can be made through architecture's expressive potential. So some facts about our faculty might reinforce this claim. We offer 7 undergraduate degree programs as well as 6 postgraduate degrees and an additional 3 programs in research. And we place in each program a high value on international engagement to enable development of student knowledge in a global context. But we also use Sydney, I think a great subject for the built environment, a subject of study, as a kind of laboratory for both design, projects and research. And we place a strong emphasis on research, with particular built environment expertise being developed within the University of New South Wales Built Environments Research Centre, City Futures, and Bill Randolph is here from there, and also the Centre for Health Assets Australasia, CHAR. We have about 100 permanent staff and about a further 200 industry professionals who contribute to teaching, learning and research, as well as 70 direct research students. And we would say as a result that we're one of the larger faculties of its kind in Australia. We design the programs to challenge and to encourage students to set and achieve high standards of performance as they progress through their degrees, and hopefully integrate creativity with professionalism and rigorous thought, but always thinking from a global perspective and always emphasising what is in fact the motto of the university, from the hand or by the hand and mind, practical skills. We're your host tonight because of our connections with Skyplane. These are varied connections with the editors and contributors and members of the profession who supported it. The faculty benefits from the contribution of visiting professors Richard Francis Jones and Lawrence Neal. Professor Xing Ruan is, of course, Head of Discipline in Architecture. And Dr. Deborah van der Plat is also a UNSW alumnus and once a part-time member of the staff. We welcome her back, and maybe we can entice her to return one day for a longer length of time. Demonstrating that the faculty is a place for leading thinkers in the field, Skyplane also includes contributions by some of our staff members, Paul Hogben and Robert Freestone, for example. I think Skyplane shows why the faculty is a vibrant place for intellectual discussion with strong connections with members of the profession. And I think you may find in Skyplane's many ways of thinking about architecture and valuing the contribution to a better future world that thinking and writing about architecture does contribute to. So without really indicating personal preferences, I will pick out a couple of examples from Skyplane that makes this point. So we have, on the one hand, the story of the first high-rise in Sydney, the AMP story, the corporate story, the Peddlethorpe and Walker story, or Australia Square, of course. And we also have the reflections of Emilio Ambas on his extraordinary New York City skyscraper that include, I thought quite interestingly, his comment that Peter Cook is one of the few architects of integrity operating in the world today. So as it happened, my wife and I recently visited one of his few built works in Graz, about a month ago, I think, and amongst other buildings I might add that we visited to better understand this point of view. I think I've worked it out. It's also important to acknowledge the generous donors that enabled the publication of Skyplane. Their financial support demonstrates that they value the contribution of scholarly essay and architectural case studies to the discussion of architecture and the making of cities. In particular, I thank Architectus, BlueScope Steel, Blyvoll and Neild, Connell Wagner, Cox Architects, Crone Partners, Architecture Studios, Francis Jones Morford Thorpe, Group GSA, Hassel Architects, Johnson Pilton Walker, Mervac, the New South Wales Government Architect, PTW Architects and Tanner Architects. And I also acknowledge the personal commitment by Lawrence Neild in facilitating the contribution of these leading firms. I now wish to particularly thank Lawrence for permitting content to become a publication from our faculty in the future. I'm able to announce tonight that content, the publication he founded, with the support of Richard Francis Jones, has a secure future, as it now will continue to be published from the University of New South Wales Built Environment through a new editorial board that includes both Lawrence and Richard. So thank you. I also know that we are joined tonight by many of the representatives of the firms who are actively participating in the life of the faculty. This support is essential to the growth and development of the faculty. In fact, this year the faculty welcomed its first cohort of co-op scholars in architecture, construction, management and property programs. The scholarships are established entirely through the leadership of sponsoring firms. So far, Bovis Lend-Lease, Brookville Multiplex, Hassel and Lang O'Rourke. Let me make a plug. If your firm is looking to identify the top talent and nurture them through their degree, which includes working for your organisation, I strongly encourage you to investigate establishing a co-op scholarship, and I'd be happy to discuss it with you. It's an excellent way for you to establish connections with some of the best and brightest of our students. So thank you for doing that so far. It's a new program for us. We are honoured tonight particularly to be joined by Professor Philip Goad, the Director of the Melbourne School of Design, who will launch Skyplane. The editors in the evening will give us a brief or short presentation to spark your questions for the discussion panel to follow. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Philip Goad, who may be known to many of you. He's an authority on modern architecture and internationally known for his research. Philip has worked extensively as an architect, conservation consultant and curator. He's an expert on the life and works of Robin Boyd and has held visiting scholar positions at Columbia University, Bartlett School of Architecture London and UCLA Los Angeles. He is the past editor of Fabrications, the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, Australia and New Zealand, and is a contributing editor to Architecture Australia. Along with Associate Professor Julie Willis, he's the editor of the proposed Encyclopedia of Australian Architecture. Please welcome Philip Goad.
Thank you, Alec. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the Dean of the Faculty of the Built Environment, Alex Arness, for the opportunity to be here this evening. Any publication by Australian architects and Australian academics is, to my mind, a cause for celebration. Skyplane, it's very clear, if you haven't got one already, I suggest you purchase one, is a publication that will achieve the status of a key document, both now and in the future. So what's it all about? What's Skyplane really all about? The tall building in our cities continues to intrigue public and professionals alike. It's a building type that crosses cultures. It's a building type that has the promise of the sublime, but also harbours the spectre of destruction. It's a building type that typifies the architect as an apparently lone and viable hero, almost always male. Yet it's also a building type that can only be achieved through the architectural office as a collaborative venture. Teams of specialists, entrepreneurial, design and technical, always in teams. It's a building type that commands intensely personal reactions. My own personal experience as a young boy with the Skyscraper was the infrequent but highly memorable visit to my father's office in BHP House in William Street in Melbourne. BHP House was designed by Yunkin Freeman, and it's a brilliant and original black steel elaboration of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill and the Bangladeshi engineer Fazlur Khan's structural steel tubes that reached for the sky. Here was not only a striking piece of urbanism that understood Melbourne street architecture, but it also contained an interior world of corporate glamour. For me, as a young lad thinking about architecture, it was a transformative experience. Now, this idea of transformation, made possible by the seemingly pragmatic, commercially, sometimes grubby, construction of a tall building, is a theme that runs through Skyplane, a collection of 13 essays that together, I believe, make a fascinating collection. And after reading it from cover to cover, it provoked in me a new respect for a type that invites alternately adulation but also vilification. Now, I'm going to very quickly go through the 13 essays because you need to see it as a whole. I think this is really what's quite valuable about it. Lawrence Neild delivers a fitting introductory essay to this volume. He weaves history and contemporary practice, sounding warnings, hailing icons where appropriate, like Gioponti's Pirelli Tower, and decrying the barrenness of a city like Houston, and wondering whether there might be an ethical tall building. David Leatherbarrow's essay is a brilliant reflection on the idea of skyline rather than skyplane, and the idea of skyline from near and far. With his two case studies, George Howe's PSFS building in Philadelphia and Renzo Piano's Aurora Place in Sydney, Leatherbarrow skillfully makes analogies with distant views of the Acropolis and the ability of a skyline of a metropolis to initiate a dialogue with other buildings, scales and forms. It's one of those essays that really grows on you as you read through it. And what's marvellous about it is that you go to his references at the back, and I looked at them and I thought, every architecture student should read these. This is required reading, please. Joseph Rickwert's essay, After the Towers, is provocative. He argues that the high-rise city is destructible after 9/11. But he also argues that grassroots community activism for, and I quote, citizens to regain control of the urban fabric. While China might be emulating Houston and not Manhattan, Rickwert's call is for a return to the Greek idea of polis, where citizens through debate might share a vision of what form their city might take. Richard Francis Jones and Kenneth Frampton focused their attention on Raymond Abraham's wonderfully enigmatic and yes totemic Austrian Cultural Forum in New York, a wonderful building which I'd never really understood or known much about before, that was completed in 1992. It's a 24-storey sliver of a building that slopes back away from the street and up. And I especially enjoyed reading Kenneth Frampton's difficulty in interviewing Raymond Abraham, finally getting him to admit that his work is, and I quote, almost inexplicable. Jing Ruan's comprehensive historical survey of the Dong Towers in southern China suggests that not all tall buildings are rooted in greedy commerce, but some, like the Dong Tower, might serve as a community locus, in Jing's word, as symbolic capital. I also really enjoyed Desmond Hui's lucid description of residential towers in Hong Kong and his perceptive conclusions about one particular project called Yinghua Court, a tower of no especial architectural merit, but one that he says is virtuous, giving sunlight, air, cross-ventilation and amenity for a home in the sky, as well as amenity at street level. His is an argument for a more generic and responsible type that eschews smart skins, mechanical ventilation and deep plans of its more luxurious neighbours. It's a lesson that many of our very respected colleagues in the profession, when they're designing apartments, could take great note of. As you can tell, I'm running through the table of contents, and I'm doing this because all of these papers are equally stimulating in their pointed and largely constructive critique of the skyscraper. Gavor Khartounian, in typical style, writes one of the most penetrating essays on OMA's CCTV headquarters in Beijing. It's, for Gavor, I think, a respectful critique of Rem Koolhaas's engagement with the skyscraper as a speculative type, suggesting that CCTV is a type of anti-skyscraper, resisting the temptation to soar. I immediately thought of Eldazitsky's Wolkenbugel, his so-called cloud hangers, which were similar to CCTV, critical statements on what it means to build on the skyline. And it was only through Gevorg's writing and suggestion that what Koolhaas was doing with CCTV was referring back to his interest in Russian constructivism, that all of a sudden the form of CCTV, this sort of inability of it to reach for the sky, makes some sense. Paul Hogman, who's here this evening, brings the discussion back to Sydney with his carefully researched account of the mixed reception of the skyscraper locally here in Sydney. And importantly, the use of media to foster professional obsessions with images of contemporaneity and newness, something which our profession also loves. Robert Freestone's paper on Sydney's first skyscraper, the AMP building, is a detailed and extremely thoughtful case study of patronage, the politics of regulation, and a building's mixed reception, due possibly, as Freestone notes, to its, and I quote, AMP's demure personality. In the end, he argues, that AMP's greatest legacy is that it acted as a catalyst for the rest of the city to gallop forward ever higher and ever bigger. Andrew Wilson's essay on Torbreck in Brisbane argues for the Californication, excuse the pun, of the high-rise residential tower in Brisbane, and Philip Thallis gives, like Freestone, a detailed account of the design and construction of Harry Sadler's Australia Square, arguing that it is a project of rupture, and positively so. But he still asks for very much an unresolved question. Can a whole city centre be constituted out of the Tower Plaza model? Then Chris Smith ponders theories of extension and transparency in considering Architectus and Ingenhoven Architekten's proposal for O1 Bly, a double glass skin ovoid pencil, concluding that extension, or as I read it, height, leads to the double-edged phenomenon, and I quote, of maximal disaster and maximal pleasure. Finally, one of the four editors, Deborah Vanderplat, muses on the sources, among them William Letherby, for the Griffins' proposal for Canberra's Capitol, the ziggurat tower of archives that would have formed the intellectual heart of the nation. She also adds a postscript on the morphosis design for the Faré Tower at La Défense in Paris, and concludes with a statement that I believe echoes across all 13 essays in this volume. And this is Deborah's words here. The intent of the tower remains an ideological one, be it one that is expressed through the mechanisms of delight and spectacle. Can I therefore especially congratulate Skyplane's editors Richard Francis Jones, Lawrence Neild, Jing Wan and Deborah Vanderplat. This is a rich and necessary read, and in doing so, it therefore gives me great pleasure to officially launch Skyplane, a special issue of content devoted to, from above and below, the mystery and wonder of the tall building. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philip. Well, we have a special treat tonight. Each one of the editors will give a brief presentation, starting with Richard Francis Jones. Richard is a partner of Francis Jones Morford Thorpe, FJMT, and has led many highly acclaimed and awarded projects, in fact, integral to the building here and other places that you've passed on the way here is the work of Richard Francis Jones. He's a visiting professor of architecture at the University of New South Wales, and he's convened several architectural conferences and was also president of the New South Wales chapter of the Institute of Architects from 2001-2002. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Alec. So I thought I would try and reflect a little bit on some of the essays. You intimidated me a little bit there, Philip, with your comprehensive and eloquent summary of the entire publication. And I thought I would do this with apologies to the great New York novelist Paul Auster as a kind of proposition about three ideas and focusing around the city of New York, a city in which I know a little bit about. And so this is a kind of demystification at a certain level, but also, I have to say, a bit of a mystification as well. The first of these, and there are three of them, is the myth of the skyplane. And that is that the sky, of course, is not a plane. There is the sky and there are planes flying in it, but there is really no sky plane. There is a ground plane, a surface, but not for the sky. It's more a field or a zone, an almost endless three-dimensional space. So perhaps what we think about when we talk about the sky plane is the vertical plane upon which the urban silhouette of a city is drawn, like a line on a page. The profile or the silhouette, the skyline. And it is the nature of these urban profiles that David Leatherborough explores in his essay Skylines. The characterising or almost caricature of a city that perhaps has more existential meaning for us than the abstraction of the plan, which is why so many city maps include drawings of buildings that make up the image in our minds of what this city is. And it's the sympathy between the sky and the ground plane that David is most interested in, and in particular that of the Philadelphia Savings Fund Society building, a building which he knows very well. And as the consummate academic that David Leatherborough is, like a great athletic diver, he sets himself a move with an incredibly high level of difficulty, as if to say, what building in the world is least like the PSFS building? I know, the Acropolis. And then proceeds to convince us that they are similar, at least in terms of this defining urban empathy between skyline and ground plane that lies at the very heart of our comprehension of the city. The silhouette of New York is perhaps the most memorable and characterising of any city. And it was damaged forever by the catastrophic events of the removal of the World Trade Center, the impact of which shadows incredibly heavily and weightily over the paper by Joseph Rickwerk, as if the fall of this one tower or this one pair of towers is somehow the defeat of them all. Destruction and tragedy at this great scale is potent with meaning, and this event demanded a complex and powerful poetic. But what does it say of New York City and contemporary architecture that in the late 20th century it was unable to deal with this event, to rise to the poetic challenge? The city of great ambition and certainty that gave us the Rockefeller Center, the Seagram Building, Brooklyn Bridge and Central Park was unable, it appears, and perhaps this is a little bit judging prematurely as these buildings haven't been built, but this seems uncertain, superficial, empty, and ultimately indifferent, and reflects a kind of crisis of representation, a failure of interpretation, of making tangible those events and the weight of them. And it's ironic, in fact, given, as Loos said, that architecture really resides in the tomb and the monument, that this city was unable at this most demanding moment to come to terms with this tragedy. And what we have is a collection of tall buildings. The other myth is that of the tower as an urban evil. The interconnectedness of the tower and suburban sprawl is false. The interconnection of the tower and the dominance of the private automobile is false. The interconnection of the tower and an alienated street life is false. The interconnection of the tower and sustainability is an unanswered question. But we need to bear in mind that this is still a relatively new typology in the history of architecture, and one which architects are still understandably coming to terms with. The tower necessarily ascribes a high urban density. Urban density should support and encourage public transport, urban life and vitality, sustainability, and in fact work against and contradict suburban sprawl. And this is true of cities like New York and other cities such as Hong Kong. And the last point is mystical towers. Is the tower necessarily tall? It is more about proportions or ratios. Can the public domain be vertical? Can there be public towers? The Museum of Contemporary Art, recently completed in the Bowery in New York by Sachima, and the Austrian Cultural Forum by Roman Abraham in Midtown, pose these questions back to us. Neither have parking, neither are commercial or private, neither preference the automobile or private transport. Both support the public life of the city, and both are loaded with representational force and provocation. These two mysterious modern objects are inserted into New York's Midtown and the Bowery, and this great city would be less for their absence. Thank you.
I now introduce Lawrence Neal of Studio Neal. Lawrence is also a visiting professor of architecture at the University of New South Wales and was previously professor of architecture at the University of Sydney. He has many great buildings to his credit, including the University of Sunshine Coast Library and the Sydney and Beijing Olympic Tennis Centres. Thank you, Lawrence.
Thanks, Alex, and it's wonderful that we are finally launching this edition of content, and let's hope there'll be many more great editions. And thank you, Philip, for your kind words. As an introduction, I want to talk about the modern movement, modern architecture, and modern objects. I make an important distinction between modern architecture and the modern movement. Modern architecture is merely the architecture of today. The modern movement is a revolutionary reconsideration of architecture that started with, according to Giacomo De Carlo, with William Morris, and was consolidated in the 1920s, particularly in Germany. Towers tell us much about modern architecture and much about the modern movement. The modern movement brought a new relationship with power. It brought into consideration those who would occupy the building, rather than just the privileged agents of power who, even certainly in the 18th century, but right almost into the 19th century, were the main reasons, as it were, for architecture. It proposed a style that should not impact on the operational order of the building. Technical innovation, particularly steel and concrete, allowed new and less constrained ways of building. Furthermore, and importantly, industrialisation and urbanisation gave architecture a new mandate. Hospitals, factories, railway stations, airports, apartments, to mention just a few. These were now important architectural propositions. This is Mies van der Rohe's proposal for a tower in Berlin in 1922. At this time, Mies worked in Berlin with Hugo Hering, and they were the founder members of Der Ring, a precursor of CIAM. This tower, as you can see, is very organic and seems to be strongly influenced by Hering. Hering was one of the first to articulate the need for engagement and even collaboration with the user in the design, and secondly, the importance of site. Each building proposition to him was unique. Building was always contingent on use and contingent on the site. Mies and Hering avoided the word architecture, which was for the powerful. They preferred Bauform. Hugo Hering wrote and was very much the centre of the thinking in Berlin in 1922, but only did two buildings. This is his famous Garkau Farm of 1922 near Lübeck, and amazingly, the Siemensstadt, which he designed and finished in 1929 with master planning by Hering's friend and confidant Hans Scharoun, and it is still going well today, as you can see. And of course, in many ways, the influence of Hering and Scharoun, which was abruptly terminated by the Nazis, but nevertheless was an important and great thread of modern architecture, the modern movement. Now, Mies, after that organic tower, went to America to become the head of the Armour Institute in Chicago, later IIT, and there he designed and developed this language of steel and glass, and in this case bronze I-beams down the outside in the Seagram Tower of 1954 with Philip Johnson and a famous client, Phyllis Brothman Lambert, who persuaded her father to use Mies on this great building. But interestingly, this was very similar to 860 Lakeshore Drive in Chicago of 1948, which were apartments. And it seems surprising that Mies said to Phyllis Lambert, "Form is not the aim of our work, but only the result." And yet we see here a building that is very similar to 860 Lakeshore Drive. Mies's Seagram developed slightly. It brought in the universal grid of the 4-foot fluorescent tube that brought in supposed flexibility of design. But unlike his old workmate Herring, he was interested in transcendence. He was not interested in contingency, as we see between 860 Lakeshore Drive and the Seagram. And in a sense, Mies became the head of the Werkbund. He, in 1927, became very central in CIAM, and people like Aalto and Herring felt that they were on the outside. And as Aalto said about CIAM, what starts as a revolution ends up as a dictatorship. So towers moved from an original response, a contingent building about their use, to buildings that transcended use, such as these towers that we see, not nearly as well done as Mies's, but we see all around the world. But we've moved even beyond that now, where we see this extraordinary buildings in Dubai. Here, Burj Dubai, designed by SOM, who of course did, they were a different office of SOM, had done the immediate predecessor of the Seagram building, the Unilever building in New York. SOM designed this, which is now the tallest building in the world, may even be exceeded by another building soon in Dubai, where the physical form was a response to too much money or credit and too little thinking. As I've shown elsewhere, every time the tallest building is announced, the world moves into recession. And one can trace this easily back from 1890 through to the Woolworths building, through to the Chrysler building, and of course these very tall buildings are in fact only symbols. They are not economically at all useful. The Empire State Building has made no money at all for its owners. And the builders of this building, Nakil, an Australian working for them, told me that this would make absolutely no money or be any use. It was simply a symbol that would sell the other buildings in this part of Dubai. So we move now away back into the question of style, into the architecture of pure form. So we get towers like this, and then Zahi Haddad like this, developing an architecture which is not at all contingent, simply the architecture of pure form. So towers have moved beyond Mies, beyond the transcendence of Mies, to become simply consumer objects, very large consumer objects. They have the same life as automobiles, refrigerators or washing machines. Philip Fisher has distinguished 4 stages of object life. 1, the materials or things that they're made of. 2, parts in which shape is given to materials to create repeating identical parts or elements. 3, assembly, in which working objects are made out of a variety of parts drawn from different elements or stocks. And 4, very importantly for us today, obsolescence, debris or junk, in which we face a mixed set of former objects. We see in the towers that we're building today very early obsolescence. Use that floor plates change, technology changes. Unlike the great palaces of Venice, which are used over and over again, we find after 25 years most of these sorts of towers are unusable. So we get here a range of these towers in Dubai. I think rather coquettish lineup, like street prostitutes, all trying to draw attention to themselves. Our modern object towers have this exact object life like automobiles, writ large, shiny, fashionable skin, routine and repeatable planning, and junk in 25 years. 70% of our landfill is building debris. Balfour, if I could go back to Herring and Mies, should not be a mere modern object. The office towers are a clear example of how the principles of the revolutionary modern movement have been overcome by the architecture of pure form. And in a very important quote which is relevant tonight, Alvar Aalto said in 1927, "What is the use of change in form if it is not a change in content?" And in fact, that's one of the reasons that Richard and I called this content.
It's good to hear the origins of the word. So our third speaker is Professor Jing Ruan. He's a professor, of course, here and the head of discipline in architecture. He's the author of Allegorical Architecture 2006, New China Architecture 2006, and co-editor with Paul Hogben of Topophilia and Topophobia. Welcome, Jing.
I'm going to try to give you a categorical answer for this burning question within 5 minutes. Now, this book, as I see it, is to ask this question: what does the tower say? I think, as Philip's insightful and eloquent introduction shows, the book actually doesn't give you that answer. And perhaps the collection of the thoughts and the essays give you multi-layered answers. For me, that's the starting point. But I'm going to take a risk to offer you a more categorical answer to it, simply for the sake of entertaining you. Now, towers are not new. They have been with us for many thousands of years, and the humans always build towers. But a modern tower often is built with glass and steel. I'm going to ask you to take a look at of this glass tower proposed by 2 Russian architects, Brodsky and Yukin, when they were working on the Soviet totalitarian regime. So they proposed a glass tower in the middle of a big metropolis. And as you can see, this glass tower is a glass cylinder, and then there's a staircase that takes you to the top of the tower. And then they ask this question: what does a tower do to fight off enemies, to make the land use more economical, or perhaps to make the TV transmission more convenient and easier? And they said, no, it's a lie. In fact, people build a tower, most importantly, a glass tower, for a little man. So this little man can climb up the tower through this glass cylinder to the top, which often is the summit or a viewing platform. And then thanks to the magic property of the glass, this little man will be magnified, and hence the whole city will see him. Now, take a special notice of the lower part of his body. It's been magnified even larger to give him a more sort of muscular look. Satirical it may be, and in fact, in my view, this is remarkably close to reality. As Lawrence has shown, the important legacy of glass tower was proposed by Mies van der Rohe in the earlier part of the 20th century. So what does a glass and steel tower actually say or actually do? In fact, they work in a very simple way. They only cater to, in my view, our vision alone. Very much like what Mies envisaged in the earlier part of the 20th century. These days, we build a glass tower as a stack of horizontal plates. So a tower is to be admired at in the distance as a beautiful object, as Lawrence said, shining with, most importantly, a layer of metallic sheen. But once you walk into the tower, and then the convenient vertical connectivity, the magic lift, will take you to different levels of this horizontal plate. And immediately, your vision is turned outwards. So the tower becomes a viewfinder. Now, the best of the summit that can offer the tourist or visitor occasional opportunity to have a good view of the city probably does very little in a symbolic sense to expand the citizens' horizon. So that's the modern scenario. But in a pre-modern scenario, and in fact, a tower caters more than just the vision. It caters to, interestingly enough, a combination of our senses. As Professor Tuan has pointed out, Gothic spires in medieval cities would work as towers because they do visually dominant. But in fact, medieval city fabric would be rather crowded. So the real impact of a Gothic cathedral, in fact, is after you walk in. The internalization of the tower, the verticality, which is to work on you, is the magic. Hence, there's this combination of music, someone is playing organ, and the heavenly light filtered through the stained glass windows, and the incense is burning, and you probably can even feel the subtle odor disseminated from moist sandstone, and that invites you to touch. So that's a Gothic cathedral, and that's a combination of our senses, not just the vision alone. But even better is that when the internalization of the tower as a configuration, when the verticality is more than just a viewfinder. And in this case, which I have tried to use in that book to illustrate the workings of the configuration, is to show you a tower. In a kind of pre-modern society, as we normally call a traditional society, these days they are only sustained by tourism. It is this verticality and that works to animate social life. So a dome tower in a dome society works first and foremost as the hearth of the society. And literally, it's a fire pit. But in the meantime, it also works as the city council or village council. So all the important things like the rite of passage for a young boy, name giving, marriage, courtship between young men and young women, and major decisions would actually be centered around this internalized world. And of course, height and verticality are very important, but important in a potent symbolic manner, because the tower is there to expand your horizon. Thank you.
And finally, before our discussion, which Philip will convene, we have Dr. Deborah van der Plat, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the School of Architecture at the University of Queensland. Her published work considers 19th century theories on the imagination, modernity, mythography, and their relation to the architecture of the period. Welcome, Deborah.
Thank you. The idea I'd just like to throw into the mix tonight, and one which I tried to consider in my essay, is that of the iconic tower. Perhaps this is touching on the mysterious tower mentioned by Richard, and it is also touching a little on the towers in Dubai that Lawrence was talking about. The iconic tower, I would like to suggest, can be associated with three key ideas. One, forsaking the goal of height that is often associated with the tower typology, the iconic high-rise, I would suggest, is often formally innovative, sculptural in quality and artistic in aspiration. Two, such aesthetic goals are often coupled with green credentials. The iconic tower nearly always integrates and actively promotes, be it visually or verbally, sustainable technologies. Three, the iconic tower often, although not exclusively, appears in locations that have actively resisted the tower typology, such as European city centres. The green and artistic credentials claimed by these buildings, I would suggest, have played a fundamental role in this introduction. A good example of these three ideas is the current image on the screen. Scheduled for completion in 2015, FAR by the architectural firm Morphosis and led by the Californian architect Tom Main, a 300-metre, 68-storey tower providing 130,000 square metres of office space, is intended to be the keystone to the redevelopment of the La Défense business district just outside of Paris. Its form is both visually striking, denying the visual stability of any one vantage point, via a skin that constantly shifts and morphs as the tower vertically ascends. Anthropomorphic in character, the lifting of the metal skirt which spreads out to cover the ground floor plaza and the giant escalators leading up to the elevated lobby is, to borrow the architect's words, like a layered dress or a woman's slip. And the tower formally verges on the sculptural. It reminds me of Xing's picture that you just put with the human figure with the muscular legs. Superimposed over this is a layer of imagery and language, one that consciously evokes the building's green credentials, such as the forest of wind turbines that terminate the tower and which are designed to meet some, if not all, of the building's power needs. While FAR exists currently only as a set of computer-generated drawings and models, and I would assume now a building site since its completion is set for 2015, it is preceded by a number of notable examples such as Foster's Gherkin in London, completed in 2003, Jean Nouvel's Torre Akbar in Barcelona, completed in 2006, and Santiago Calatrava's Turning Torso of 2005. My interest in these towers was not so much in whether they were successful examples of the tower form or not, and I have to admit it wasn't to consider their impact on the city either. Many of these issues had already been dealt with by a number of early essays in the book, such as Joseph Rickwett's essay After the Towers, David Leverborough's Skylines, and Lawrence's introduction, The Modern Object. I also wasn't really interested in thinking about whether their stated goals of being artistic or sustainable were effectively achieved. The idea of the tower artistically considered has again already been looked at in Gevork Hartunian's comparative essay of the Wainwright Building and the CCTV complex. And the issue of sustainability and its use in the modern tower, on the other hand, is considered in some detail in Chris Smith's essay on O1 Bly. Rather, my interest lay more in why FAR and its predecessors were being very consciously promoted, both by the architects and the professional press, as being artistic objects. The disciplinary slippage between architecture and art is, of course, nothing new. Possibly one of the more famous examples of this blurring between art and architecture is the late 19th century debate between the Royal Institute of British Architects and the memorialists led by Richard Norman Shaw. arguing whether the discipline of architecture should be promoted as a professional practice or art form, one equal to painting and sculpture in its expressive or phonetic capacity. Much of this debate was centred on the issue of registration and the role of examinations within the architect's education. A secondary and less recognised aspect of this debate, however, was whether the idea of construction or building fell within the artistic domain of the architect, or whether it could be outsourced to the specialist engineer or surveyor. Supporting the latter, the Royal Institute of British Architects and the Committee for the Registration of Architects identified both the labour and thought associated with construction or building, including that provided by the engineer, with the purely technical, scientific, and more importantly, as being non-expressive or capable of carrying symbolic content, and therefore phonetically mute. Contesting this assertion were the memorialists led by Norman Shaw, who argued that the science of construction, much like the craftsmanship of ornament, was expressive, and that is to say artistic, and must therefore always remain within the domain of the architect. I would suggest that it is this tension between architecture, artistically conceived, and engineering that continues to be played out in the present-day iconic tower. As a building type, the high-rise tower, from initial developments in fireproofing to the ever-increasing desire for height, is one that has had a very strong association with the engineer. This association, I would also suggest, has historically rendered the architectural status of the tower typology as questionable. Again, a sense of this tension emerges in a number of essays that appear in Skyplane, including Paul Hogben's The Spectre of the Skyscraper, Robert Freestone's discussion of the AMP building in Skyscraper Megalomania, and Philip Tallis's essay on Australia Square. Although in this latter issue, this tension between architecture and engineer is celebrated rather than subverted. The more recent introduction of green technologies or science to the tower form, I would argue, coupled with advances in computer-generated design, has only further accentuated this tension. Seeking to address questions of architectural authenticity within such examples has consequently also seen a move towards schemes in which the boundaries between architecture and art, using strategies that differ little from those developed in the 19th century, are increasingly blurred. Visually aligning the sustainable tower with sculptural form has enabled the green building, disguised as the iconic building, to reassert its status as architecture proper. So it's my controversial idea to introduce into the mix. Seen from this perspective, an interest in the tower form lies not so much in how it engages with the city or with sustainability or even with the idea of art, but rather how it continues to engage with fundamental and rather old debates regarding the nature of architectural practice, the division of labour and the role of the architect. Thank you.
It was fascinating hearing the four of you present just then. And perhaps less so from Deborah at the end, but there seemed to be a sort of not very thinly veiled critique of the skyscraper, and in some respects a sort of gloomy outlook potentially on the idea of the skyscraper. Am I reading that incorrectly? Because Lawrence, for example, how might one change the content of the skyscraper that one might not necessarily be so equivocal about the idea of the skyscraper?
Well, I agree. The problem with all these things is that it slips so easily into the architecture of pure form, and I particularly think that that final example that Deborah was showing, unless we consider the users, and in my particular work in office buildings has always been to work with who is going to occupy the building and develop a collaboration with those. Of course, many towers don't do that or refuse to do it. The tallest buildings in the world, there's obviously no collaboration. I think that it's an extremely powerful, as I said, but my problem is that it's never going to be a powerful thing if it's merely just the architecture of pure form, but unless it brings together all the contingencies of architecture and all the richness of the cities and the richness of life within the towers. And I think very few towers, and I'm saying, as I said in my essay, many of them do. I mentioned both the Hong Kong-Shanghai Bank by Foster and his use of getting people out of the lifts and changing at levels and getting them to mix. I mentioned Gio Ponti's tower in Milan. There are towers that do reflect the complexity of life, but unfortunately they're not in the majority. And I think those wonderful ones that Richard shows, I absolutely agree that they are tremendous examples of towers.
Well,
but unfortunately they're in the minority.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask Richard about those two, and related to this same question, this idea of the patron, the Sejima Tower that you showed and the Austrian Cultural Forum clearly had patrons whose brief necessitated them to go vertically, and these are public programs. But is that sheer chance?
Well, look, if I could just first make a point about the tower is generally big, right? It sticks up. And when you stand up, you usually make yourself a target. And yet my argument is that the tower is fundamental in today's world. We're seeing massive density increases in our cities, and we really do have to solve this problem. And it's not solved at the level of the individual tower, it's actually solved at the level of the city. And the example of New York is one of the greatest cities we have, and it's actually full of some very fine towers, and it's full of a lot of really bad ones. But the reality is that the sum of these towers is much greater than the individuals. And in the example like Dubai, of course, it's the reverse. You put all of those things together and somehow the whole thing is less. So I'm actually very supportive of the tower typology, and I think we've got to get it right. And I think there are plenty of examples about what's right about it. The other point I was trying to make there is this representational quality that architecture has to confront, and that some projects demand a greater poetic representation than others. If you're designing a purely commercial tower that's got to fit into a city, then the pressure is less than if you're trying to build a tower or a complex of towers around ground zero in New York City. The poetic demands are very different. So there I'm suggesting we have failure. And by example, I was of course referring to two public buildings in a sense that are towers, and also posing this question about how can we make towers more public. And there we have a kind of very distilled approach from some very talented architects. But, you know, perhaps it's a little bit easier. There's less pressure putting an art museum into the Bowery than responding to the great contradiction of demands that New York City put on great designers at ground zero. It's not just the architect's fault, it's a failure of the city.
Sure. Now, what you were saying, and it probably refers more to high-rise cities like Manhattan and like Hong Kong, where one lives in a tower, and that's normal, it's every day. And so we're actually having to rethink an urbanism that's essentially high-rise and make sure we get that urbanism, particular form of urbanism, right.
Yes, but I have to say the life in a tower somehow is a segmented life. There's no different from the kind of Victorian life in the 19th century. You know, the relationship between two rooms at two ends of the corridor, and the relationship between two plates on different levels of the tower. There's no fundamental difference. But Manhattan and Hong Kong are much more livable, largely are due to the success of the ground plan. And the towers look remarkably interesting and business-like. They contribute to that. But that is not to say, and the configuration of the towers actually work to contribute to that.
Sure.
One of the, just on that thing in Hong Kong, one of the interesting things that Desmond Huey's thing on Hong Kong he mentioned was how dumb the towers have become since they air-conditioned and didn't have all the bathrooms on the external walls. You got those very thin slivers of towers because you had natural
light ventilation,
which goes back to my view about you know, the collaboration and use and developing in a sense from the inside out, and the form being the result of the inside, not the overweening form
Yeah, and it's almost, I think it relates to what Deborah's brought up, because I started writing things like totem, useless, monument, all of those things where the high-rise city, if one takes it, that these are like icons and pure acts of dexterity in terms of composition, they become the if you like, the cliched useless monument. I mean, the whole thing, they become purely about composition. And Desmond Hui's article suggests, and Lawrence is suggesting there might be another way. I mean, you can have both. I mean, any city consists of monuments and building. But Deborah, this idea of the totem and this building at biomorphosis, I'm not sure how to pronounce. I thought it was called Fare, but Far, I've got no idea.
I was tutored before the talk by a French speaker and was told it was Far.
Far, okay, I'll get it right.
I
I was thinking it had some intrinsic connection to New Zealand in a weird way. But this Far, which was showing a bit of leg, it has to be said, what you're arguing, therefore, was that in a way it was justifiably useless, justifiably in terms of iconic. I mean,
I suppose what I was sort of interested in is that there seems to be this interesting overlay of this assertion of the tower, the particular type of tower as iconic. And then it's sort of coupled with the sustainable technology. So you have this coupling of green, sustainable technologies. You have these...
but green is a sort of functional excuse for it, for again, composition.
It is about form, but it's also then about, maybe it's about form, it's about monument, but it's also about architecture and what the role of the architect is and what the role of the architectural building is as opposed to building.
Right. Now I'm going to ask two of our essayists from the floor whether they've got things to add. Robert?
I guess what I would be interested in the panel, perhaps commenting on, is just those interactions that architects have with other forces of finance and planning, and the extent to which they can actually shape and sometimes destroy an architectural vision.
Right. I think it is a very important point, because for too long architects have followed what real estate agents have told them. And what they've told them is that this formula for an office building, having a core and up to 12 metres to the windows, you're too big for natural lighting, but that was the real estate formula, with a central core, was the only way to organise an economical office building. And even Renzo Piano was forced into that, against his will, in the building in Macquarie Street, which has got this very conventional core and plate around it. Now, that does not work at all well for the modern office. The idea of having cores at the perimeter can work very well for larger things. The smalls, what developers picturesquely call rats and mice, work very well with the central core when you have accountants and dentists and architects and so on. But once you get any sort of big organisation, the central core doesn't work, and they were never interested until recently in ever talking to the people that were going to use the building. It is interesting in the work I've done that the very first curtain wall building in Sydney, the MLC building by Bates Smart McCutcheon in North Sydney, which had a core with two wings on either side of it, proved to be a very sustaining and sustainable office that could easily be rejigged to suit modern office organisation and use. And in fact, it's now a very successful, and it, in a sense, was the first modern office building in Sydney. And by either good management or luck, to have those plates and the core outside the plates allowed a whole way of thinking about it. And for far too long, architects have not thought about the collaboration with the users, have taken what developers and real estate agents have told them. And we've got, many useless towers that will have a very short life because of that.
Just this point about authorship and the collaboration that sits behind a large building like an office tower. The two examples that I was giving are actually like a little microclimate within that overall economic climate, where you have, in a sense, an institution that has slightly bigger aspirations that go beyond kind of just the optimisation of a site, and therefore you can see these things materialise in a way where they become actually quite potent and add a great deal to a city. But that does take place on a large scale. We saw that in Australia Square. One of the essays examines that building, and there was a patron behind that building. Seagram, I would also argue, which also had a patron behind it. And these are unique. And I think what is actually more helpful is to zoom out a little bit and not to say this is the result of architects' inability to come to terms with contemporary circumstances, but to say these buildings are not really authored by architects. They represent the social values and aspirations, or lack thereof, of our contemporary cities and our contemporary societies. And where we see other examples of how this doesn't have to be like this is by looking at these incidents where that has been escaped, and that includes towers.
Yeah. Paul, I wanted to ask you about your essay and the montages of what Sydney might look like back in around 1910, I think it was, in your essay. How different do you think those montages of Sydney, of towers, New York towers overlaid onto Sydney streets, is from what we're seeing in locations like Dubai today?
Well, yes, what I hope to bring to the publication was attention on imagery, and that imagery of skyscrapers has an interesting story and reveals interesting narratives that perhaps aren't seen as easily as what you might see when you look at skyscrapers as objects. And so what I discovered in these montages, it was a fantastic discovery just in the State Library one day, coming across these montages. Radical constructions, visions of the city of Sydney for the time, 1905, whereby cutouts of New York buildings, of skyscraper buildings, were inserted into photographs of streets of Sydney. And it was, I think, the first time that I could tell that the technique of montage within architectural image making within Sydney had been used. But I'm not 100% sure of that. But it was an attempt by the author to provoke the profession and to stir up the debate about skyscrapers in Sydney. But so when I look at the imagery of Dubai today and the imagery shown tonight, it's still manufactured imagery. It's constructed. The images are constructed. And I would be very interested in carrying out a similar type of study of the imagery today and the way imagery of skyscrapers within cities like Dubai are constructed. They're not just taken naturally, but are constructed, composed.
Sure.
And so that's a type of scholarship that's been going on for some time, but it's yet to really be executed in relation to Australian buildings and skyscrapers. About this paradox between a critical relationship to skyscrapers and a kind of editorial dependence upon them to provide eye-catching, visually exciting material for publications.
And it still goes on.
And it still goes on.
Still goes
I'm
on.
just wondering, this question is for Deb, what kind of pressures were there upon you, as I know you were responsible for gathering imagery
Digging images.
for Skyplane, to make it visually attractive and appealing, and to include some of those iconic images.
She was told do it or else. No.
Go out and find more images. I have to say most of the authors did provide a lot of the images. There was a short time, sort of towards the end of the publication, where we tried to dig up better images, or in some instances, whether those better images were more iconic or not, I'm not sure. But yes, there was definitely a lot of pressure from the publisher's point of view that it had to look good. The book had to look good. And I think that point's a really interesting point that Paul is making, and I suppose this is a point that's coming through here in the panel. There's a group of us, well, some of us, that look at these buildings as constructed images, and sort of the ideas that come through that process of constructing the image and promoting an image. And then there's the architects and a group that are looking at as a built object, and an object that's being used, and coming up with very different and readings and stories about what needs to be done and how it has to be done. And I think that there's just that point, there's multiple ways of reading this, reading the tower form, and and therefore we're getting different readings and different meanings through the different sources that we're using. And I think that's the point I had to make with Far. It'd be interesting to go back and do the reading after it has been built.
Now, I haven't asked any of the audience if it was, and this will be the last question for the evening, is there someone that desperately, James, I knew it?
Yes, thanks, Philip. Starting with the term Skyplane, because it's a terrific title, because it's loaded with so many ways of responding to it, not least, of course, the 9/11 sense of doom. But of course, what seems to me to be fairly clear with that term is not so much the skyline, but the building height plane. And that goes back perhaps to what Rob is discussing with AMP as the commercial client and breaking the sky plane of Sydney. That is, and what does the city want to do with its space above it? And I think what is really interesting about our city is that in the last 10 or 12 years, we have set out a process by which the system of patronage and the mode of production of the high tower has been sort of uncoupled from the old networks of patronage and so forth, which produced, ultimately endless mediocrity from firms like AMP, and began to get more intriguing connections between design and the developer. And so by moving decisively towards a competition process or its equivalent through some form of understanding that a better solution was possible, put Sydney, I think, in a rather distinctive category of cities that has tried very hard to improve its skyplane. And perhaps only San Francisco attempted that with Alan Jacobs, and perhaps even going right back to Berlin when they thought in 1919 or 1920 that they would limit the number of skyscrapers, and after 30 years they would revert to being owned by the citizens of the city, because the citizens of the city had allowed the buildings to penetrate the skyplane. So I'm just wondering, we have in here, we have Ray Brown, who is part of that process, and I know that Richard has also been part of a competition. I've been on many juries. It's very difficult to bring some of those schemes to realisation, because bringing together a design team and a promoter who had previously not worked with that design team has got its own dimensions to it. But it does indicate that there is something more profound in the making of the tall building in a city that is confident of its own self, and also has a design culture stimulated by events like tonight, in which the critical issues can be discussed. And I'm wondering, very briefly, if perhaps Ray and Richard, and is anyone else here who's been part of that process? But we have number 1 O'Connell Street in construction, we have 163 hopefully, Castlereagh hopefully in construction. But it's in many ways a very exciting dimension to what Sydney is doing these days.
Mm. What I would suggest is that the density of this city needs to increase, that we need to question what is the height plane in a city like Sydney now. Where is Where is that level? Where should it go to? And how can we, if we go beyond that, how can we ensure that we get buildings that actually add to the real life and cultural health of the city? And I think that one thing we can do, and the recent process over the last 5 years or so at the City of Sydney is one example of that, is to intersect public and private interests much more strongly. So one of the problems is that the typical commercial tower is exactly that. It's entirely private interest. And then maybe there's something down on the ground, perhaps there's an open space. And I'm not trying to belittle that, but I think that if we move to a different paradigm, we could actually say that it's not quite like that, that this building is maybe 1/3 public, that in fact we should be able to publicly inhabit these great rooms at the top of these buildings, which means so much to us in terms of the image of the city, that we could think of that indeed, the Berlin example. What is the payoff for the citizens of this city of allowing these things, and how can that give us objects, modern objects, that actually make and enliven our cities?
Well, Richard, I think that's a very... Oh, sorry. Ray?
Well, look, the whole discussion's been intriguing from many points of view, and I think in the process we've been through in terms of the competitive process, it's it's just very interesting to see the different takes there are on the same problem. But I think just to pick up on a couple of things that have been said, I think Lawrence was talking about the working from the inside out and the requisite form of the tower. I mean, why is the tower the form it is? I think when we work in these complex urban environments, complex environments within the city, within a complex planning regime, competitive regime, etc., there is a lot in that itself which is driving the form of the tower. Equally, there is working from the inside out and driving this, driving the form of the building to create the sort of spaces that we do need for, let's say, modern or larger organisations rather than the smaller ones. But also just, I guess, breaking the paradigm, the 12-metre core to perimeter model was very much a Sydney model, driven by structural span, driven by a central core which hides a multitude of sins. If you do a central core in a building, it really just does become a skin with a big stick in the middle holding it up effectively. But it can be not very well considered. It can chop and change and move around as you run through the building. I think it's far more intriguing to look at a building that is beautiful on every floor all the way through the building. And when you do a tower, the repetition, the plan has to be perfect. You're going to repeat it 30 or 40 or 50 times potentially, and it really should be superb for that reason and highly engineered. And then when you hit the ground, it also has to be perfect because there's a lot of intensity of use, which is all spilling out on that ground plane. And I'd just like to make one point about Richard's comment about the height of towers. I agree. I think it's a really interesting question. We've sort of, we're designing in Sydney, I think, quite a quaint little city of towers, and we have, restricted height limits and floor space, etc. And all sites are the same. I mean, all sites have 12.5 to 1 floor space ratio, but the reality is some sites could probably have twice as much and some sites could have half as much. So I think there needs to be more consideration of how we distribute these taller buildings in the city. And I think finally, to Richard's point, if we do have larger buildings, they do need to be mixed-use buildings and one, to make them more interesting, but I think probably more realistically, they need to be mixed-use buildings because we can't build something bigger than, say, 30 or 40 or 50,000 metres because developers can't do that. You can't do a 100,000 metre office tower. It's impossible in Sydney. It would never start because there'd never be enough commitment to get the thing going in terms of tenants. So they do need to be mixed use, whether it's residential, commercial, hotel, or whatever the uses may be. So,
thank you for that. And look, just to finish up, it sounds like there are a whole lot of great projects for students of urban design and architecture here to be done about thinking about what Sydney might become and perhaps collaborating with some of the practices downtown as well. I'd like to thank all of our 4 panellists and our speakers from the floor, and also particularly Alex Zanis for orchestrating this evening, and also to Chanel too for her organisation of this evening. So thank you very much everyone for coming this evening. Thank you.